Hey y'all, so I want to finish up the last little bit on variation so you have that information. There's a couple of places that we haven't talked about yet that have to do with how our genes within those populations shift. So the first part that we're going to look at here is the idea of genetic drift. And you can see on the screen the little notes to kind of keep track of what we're talking about. So when we talk about genetic drift, we're really referring to some change within that allele frequency. And remember, allele frequency means the total number of that specific allele over the total alleles possible, so all the genes that are within the population, all the alleles possible. Genetic drift, usually we're going to talk about this in a small population. And generally speaking, we're going to see within that small population, you're going to see the occurrences happening pretty regularly. It really becomes obvious when we see changes in an established population and we have movement to another group. So I'm actually going to skip past all the words for a second, and then when I kind of show you what I'm talking about, if you take a look at these images, let's see, move myself a little bit here, so that you can see our populations that we're looking at. So we talk about the fact that we have genetic drift. Drifting really means is that we have an original population, and there's a change if we had what we refer to as a migration or a split in population. So if you take a look at this large group population of these beetles, what you're seeing then is that if we have a small subset, and we created that as our starting population, or what's called a founding population, meaning it's our foundation group, then we do see that the genetics in the long term end up being different. So migration becomes an important part, because if we have one group leaving, a small group leaving from a large population, they only have the ability to reproduce with themselves, so therefore the population is going to look very different from this A population to this B population, because their founding populations are drastically different genetically. And obviously if you look at these, you can see them physically that way, and you can also see that that's due to the genetics that creates the situation. So this is called the founder effect. This is one version of genetic drift. Genetic drift is really just the change in population that you're seeing, where you see the genetics change, so drifting from one to another. So the other part that comes into play when we start talking about is we talk about what we refer to as genetic equilibrium, so balance. So we're talking about balancing out our genetics so that the allele frequencies stay about the same. This is called the Hardy-Weinberg principle. The statement actually for the principle is that allele frequencies in a population will remain constant unless one or more factors cause that frequency to change. Now the interesting thing about this is that evolution, we talk about natural selection versus the idea of genetic equilibrium. Genetic equilibrium is that balance, so that we're really talking about populations remaining stable or constant. Now, what are those factors? Because that becomes an important part. When we talk about genetic equilibrium to maintain between generations, there are 5 conditions that need to occur. Number 1, there has to be no random mating. Populations must be very large. Can be no movement into or out of the population. And there can be no mutations. And then the last one, there can be no natural selection. So realistically, if we start going through these and thinking about this, is it possible? The answer is not really, because what does random mating mean? That means that they're not picking particular organisms to be able to mate with. Instead, it is random. Does that happen? Well, not really, because we've already talked about the fact that even in nature we have natural selection occurring, and that natural selection is the idea that organisms pick those that are the best fit for their environment, and that's the changes we see in population. That's the change we're seeing in genetics. Populations must be very large. Is that realistic? The answer is no, because sometimes we're talking about very small populations. Even protected populations can be really small, and in addition we talk about populations in the natural world that can be very small. They're not all large. There can be no movement into or out of the population. Migration occurs, right? Emigration, immigration, those both happen. We've talked about that. There can be no mutations. Well, we have control most of the time of stimulation for mutations, but random mutations do occur, so is that something that we'd be able to maintain then for equilibrium to exist? The answer is no. No natural selection? Well, that again means that there'd be no adaptations to be able to survive within an environment. So really we look at these 5 conditions. Is it possible to be in genetic equilibrium? The answer is not really. So this is going to give you the definitions of what we're looking for. So random mating, equal chance of passing on alleles to its offspring. Almost never happens as that it's random. They mate because of traits. We talked about that. Large populations, again, less likely to be changed because of genetic drift, but still happens. Movement into and out of, we're talking about change of, again, genetic pool if we have movement into or out of, and so therefore it's really not very possible. Mutations, anytime we have a mutation, new alleles can either be introduced or we can talk about changes in those allele frequencies. And so mutations happen without chance, so meaning we don't really have control over those. No natural selection, that means all genotypes in the populations have equal probabilities of being able to survive, which means none of them are selected for to be better than the others. And again, not realistic. Okay, so speciation is what we just got done talking about, and it's the formation of a new species. So what does that mean? Species we've already defined as a group of organisms that can breed with another and produce a fertile offspring or a viable offspring. So there's different types of isolation that can occur. It's all about isolating them so that they do not have the ability to reproduce. Now, there's different types. Behavioral isolation, this can be courtship rituals, it could be reproductive strategies. There's actually some that happen before and after, but realistically what we're talking about is isolating it so that by behavior so they don't have the ability to reproduce. Temporal isolation, where reproduction actually occurs at different times. So most organisms reproduce in the spring, but not all, and those that don't always reproduce in the spring will have a different time frame for reproduction than those that reproduce in the spring. So if they're a winter reproduction versus a spring reproduction, spring and winter, two different times, they keep them isolated so that they don't have the ability to reproduce. Geographic isolation, this is where we are separated by a geographic barrier. Could be a river, could be a mountain. It doesn't guarantee that we're going to be making a new species. Really what happens is if they're separated long enough so that they have changes that they've gone through to be able to survive, great, then it becomes a new species. But if they don't, and it could be a geographic barrier, they still have the ability to inbreed, and when they do come back together and interbreed, they could still be the same species. Really here it is that they have to have something they've had to adapt to because of the geographic isolation kept separate from each other. Galapagos Islands we've talked about before. One of the great ways to see natural selection in action is the Galapagos Islands, especially when talking about finches. This is also a great place to be able to see speciation occur live and in action. So the finches that Darwin saw, we talked about once before, that they came from one common ancestor. And I really want you to focus on the beaks again. You can focus on the head shape if you'd like to as well, but really I want you to notice the beaks, and then I'd like you to take a look at their habitat. Those are two different things that I want you to see as we're going through these images, of the finches. So if you look at their beaks, then it actually has to do with what they eat as well, and this is the part that actually allows for them to have separated from each other and created new species. Take a look at that large ground finch. Okay, so speciation, the big thing that it came about because of is because of founding a new population. So that foundation population again becomes an important factor. They also became new species due to geographic isolation. They were actually separated from different islands, or even within the same island, different locations, and could not interbreed. And then that created a change in the population's gene pool. The gene pool was not the same from location to location, and so therefore, when we're talking about that gene pool, those changes created such a situation that genetically they became varied from each other. Reproductive isolation, whether it was due to behavior, but they were isolated so they didn't have the ability to reproduce. Most of it was not behavior, it was more due to the geographic isolation and because they weren't able to get to each other for that reproduction. Last one is ecological competition. So even if they're living in the same location, having competition for the same food or resources allowed for them to be able to specialize and make it so that they had food that they could indeed get to and habitats they needed to have so that they could be separate and different from each other. So this gives you kind of the story of how this works from South America. Remember, this is coming from Ecuador, going out to the Galapagos Islands. they're the ones that reproduce, get separated by islands. They will end up with no longer having the same gene pool because of the traits that they're taking on to allow for them to be able to survive. Skip through that, we've talked about those. And that is the end of our conversation regarding